And a lot of people are going to be listening to the podcast are simply scared by the entire process. They're scared by tests. They're in front of a computer being watched on the other end for 2.5 hours.
It's weird to be given a test in which you're expected to get stuff wrong. The GMAT is extremely well constructed for business school in particular.
Is it fair to say that it changed because they needed to adjust the scale?
We lost grammar and geometry. So 655 is the new 700.
If the GMAT is more reflective of actual day-to-day work that a business person is going to be doing, why even have the GRE at this point?
Competition is a thing and schools are competing for students.
Hi, this is Harold Szymanski with mbaMission. I'm here with my co-host Jeremy Scheinwald, as well as Stacey Koprince of Manhattan Prep. We're here today to talk about the GMAT and GRE, which changed last year. So with a year of business school hopefuls taking the new GMAT and GRE, what have we learned at this point? We're here with Stacey to talk a little bit about that. Hello, Stacey.
Hi.
So Stacey, like we said, it's been a year since the new GMAT and GRE have come online. So what are you seeing so far?
Yeah, it's interesting. The changes to the GRE were pretty minimal. It really just was made shorter. But the fundamental test stayed the same. The scoring scale stayed the same. It was a fairly minor change, although certainly welcome because the exam is only about 2 hours now, right, which is fantastic. The GMAT changes were bigger. That exam is also just over 2 hours, which again is fantastic. But the big changes on the GMAT were we lost grammar and geometry, which are great because those are two big areas of study. So no need to study those anymore.
Yeah, which is a round of applause from everybody.
I feel like there's some bad geometry joke in here, like a triangle of applause,
right.
That's, octagon of applause.
That's very fair.
Yeah, a rhombus of applause. Okay.
So that was the good side on the GMAT side, was that they removed two big chunks of material that we used to need to study. But they took what used to be called the integrated reasoning section, they changed the name to data insights. And that section used to not be part of your total score. But now it is part of your total score. So it's been upgraded, if you will, which for some people is great. For people who are used to working with stats and data analytic type stuff in their work, they're really happy with that change. And for other people, it's been not as welcome of a change.
No, that makes sense. And I also recognize it was sort of a funny time to change it. And what I mean by that is some schools only accepted what I'll call the old GMAT last year. Some schools accepted both, certainly by round 3. So you really had a good sense of how people did one versus the other. So what were you seeing?
We saw both. So we saw some people kind of rushing to take the old exam, which is pretty typical whenever there's an exam change. Humans don't like new things. We're uncomfortable with change. And so people were like, I don't know what this new thing is like, so I'm going to take the old one and get my score in while the old one still exists, because who knows what's going on with this new weird exam. But we also saw a number of people really excited to take the new test, both because it was shorter and because you no longer had to study really grammar is a huge bear. People hate that. And geometry is, I don't know why you would need geometry for business school. So they were excited not to have to do that. And if they were already fine with the data analytics type material, they saw that as an upside, because then that helps them do better on the test, right? To do well on the test.
No, that makes sense. And Stacey, I also recognize that every year you take the GMAT and the GRE.
Not every year. So we have agreements with so in the real world there are various limits to how frequently students can take the exams. Okay. We have different agreements with the testing organizations, because if we take the exam too frequently, we kill the curve essentially. Yeah. No, that makes sense. My colleagues and I. Yeah. So on average, each of our instructors, we go in to whatever exams we teach once every 3 years. Okay. And unless there's a test change. So I have actually taken all of the exams more frequently in the last few years, because we've had the pandemic era and the test change era. So
Just on the personal level, which did you like better? What were the differences? How were you thinking about it?
I have to admit that there's a special place in my heart for the GMAT. The GMAT's a good test.
You are literally the only person ever to say that in the entire world.
Me and my colleagues, like I said. The GMAT is extremely well constructed for business school in particular. Okay. It's really, really good at putting you in, I'm going to call it executive decision-making situations. And this is a function not just of the question types and the content that they're asking, but also the time pressure, the time management thing. And a lot of people really naturally freak out about the time pressure. It's weird to be given a test in which you're expected to get stuff wrong. Mm-hmm. It's weird to be given a test in which you're expected to not be able to do it all. Like if your teachers in school had given you a final exam where it was like, haha, you're only going to be able to do 2/3 of this in the 2 hours that I'm giving you. Have fun. Yeah. There would be a revolt, right? So it's weird to have that set up. But what they're mimicking is not school. What they're mimicking is work. You're sitting at your desk. What are you doing? You're going to clear your inbox today? Like, I don't know about you, but it's been a very, very long time since my inbox was cleared. There's always more to do. You're always having to prioritize. You're always having to decide I'm investing here, but not here. You're always making those trade-offs. And the test is designed to make you do the same thing. And so when people first come in and start to study, and this is true for all of the exams to an extent, but it's more pronounced on the GMAT than the other two because of the way the algorithm works, to use a fancy word. When people come in and they're trying to get ready for these exams the way that they studied for tests in school, and it doesn't work as well to have that mindset, we really try to take them into this idea of you're at your desk, you just got 4 emails, your boss is asking for something, and a coworker just popped their head in the door or on the screen or in the chat, or depending on how you're working, right, and has asked you for help with something. What are you going to do first? What are you going to do second? And what are you going to do? What are you going to say? I'm not going to get to you at all. Right. And you're having to make those decisions as you're taking the exam. And the scoring mechanism is built to allow that to happen. It's not expecting you to get everything right. It's really trying to see, can you make those decisions as you go? Can you not get sucked into one question for 10 minutes and then blow all your time and then you don't get to all this other work that you really need to do today?
When the GMAT changed, is it fair to say that it changed because there was a kind of clustering and topping out and that they needed to adjust the scale to allow for differentiation between applicants?
I think that they used the change as an opportunity to adjust the scale. So when the GMAT changed last year, they did also change the scoring scale. So unlike the GRE where the scoring scale stayed the same, the GMAT did change the scoring scale.
So previously, just so people know, it was in 10-point increments and it went to 800. Now it's still in 10-point increments, but the increments are adjusted on the basis of 5s. Well,
but it's more than that. So the old scoring scale was 200 to 800. The new scoring scale is 205 to 805. So that sounds simple, but it's actually not. So it's not like the old 700 is now a 705.
Right.
They also shifted the scoring scale. So the old 700, which is like the mark that everyone was trying to cross, that new equivalent number is 655. So they kind of like, you can think of it as they like lifted the scale and kind of moved it over.
They created more space for people?
They created more space at the top end.
So 655 in the new test is equivalent to
700 on the old test. So 655 is the new 700.
Okay, got it.
And
or for, I think, our kind of applicants, it's more like 740 is 685.
Yes, exactly. Right. If you're going for the top schools that are looking for a 730, 740 on the old scale, then yes, you're aiming for like a 685 type score. And that feels weird too, because it feels like it's lower. You're used to 6 something being not a good score. Anyway, they use this as an opportunity to adjust that scoring scale, but I don't think that's why they made the change to the test in the first place. The changes themselves, the new DI section was based on the old section integrated reasoning. That was introduced more than 10 years ago. It's been essentially in testing mode for 10 years. It was part of the exam, but not part of your total score. So they've been planning this for a long time. Right. And it really, according to, things I've heard GMAC, the organization that makes it GMAT, things that I've heard them say, it really was driven by the business schools. The business schools were looking for something that was more tightly tied to the kinds of work and the kinds of thinking that their students need to have. And data analytics is such a core part of that.
I find it interesting you say that because, and I'm not expecting you to have the answer to this, but and I agree with what you're saying. Like if the GMAT is more reflective of actual day-to-day work that a business person is going to be doing, and it is, then why even have the GRE at this point? Because the GRE isn't fully reflective.
So first of all, the changes are very recent, right? So I suppose it's possible that something like that could change over time. It's only been just over a year since these changes were made. So possibly it's the case that over time, some business schools might look at the data that they're getting and say, hey, you know what, this one is now better at predicting success in business school, and maybe that will change their policies over time. I'll also say, as with everything else in the world, competition is a thing, and schools are competing for students, and not just, and business schools are competing against other types of grad school programs where the GRE is used for other broader types of grad school programs. Right. So that's one of the big reasons the GRE was introduced in the first place. If you've got somebody who's 22 and thinking, I'm going to go to grad school, or I might want to go to grad school, but I'm not sure what for yet, the GRE is a more flexible exam because it's used for non-business school type programs as well. So that element of competition is always going to exist both with other kinds of grad programs and just among the schools, and flexibility is generally good. So I doubt we'll ever see the GRE go away. from the business school.
Yeah, at this point, it's hard to.
It's hard.
At that point, it's hard to go backwards.
The admissions officers want to have more options. Like there are various aspects to that decision. It just strikes me that the GMAT really does seem to be testing business school skills better.
I think you can still say, for as far as GRE has come and the sort of inroads that it's made into this market, it is still the case that the GMAT is kind of considered the default. Like if you think you can get the score on the GMAT, you're going to take the GMAT.
Right.
If you're not sure you're going to get the score on the GMAT, that's when you start to think about the GRE or possibly the EA if that's an option for you. Or again, if you're looking at a different program or not sure that you actually want to go to business school in general, then you'd be looking to start with the GRE.
That makes sense. Stacey, very quickly here, just explain what the EA is.
Yes, the EA is short for Executive Assessment. So this is an exam that was built for executive MBA programs. Yeah. It's essentially... It's a very short version of the old version of the GMAT. Okay. It's only an hour and a half long, and it's really designed to be, I'm going to call it like a threshold test, as opposed to like how high of a score can I get test. Right. So for executive MBA folks, people who are later in their careers, you just want to make sure that they have a certain baseline level so that they won't drown when they get into the program.
That makes sense.
It has expanded since it came out, so there are some primarily part-time evening and weekend regular MBA programs and a few full-time MBA programs that now accept it.
And I think we talked about in our other podcast, maybe it's about a half a dozen, what did we say? Duke, Darden, Columbia, NYU.
Maybe Michigan. I think Michigan might not be.
I think you are right. Michigan. I think it is Michigan.
Definitely. This could be stale dated as soon as we say it. So definitely go out there and check. But
definitely.
Yeah, there are a small number of full-time programs, and then there are still programs that even have some test optionality in them where you don't even have to take one. It's just that you need a critical mass of those programs if you want to apply broadly. And so, until you have.
Right.
Most schools doing test optional, you'll have someone who's like, well, I got to take the test for X school or Y school. I may as well really go at it.
I'm going to just interject here in terms of the test waiver. Jeremy, what has been your success with people getting test waivers? I can sort of share some of my own. And I have to say, in my own case, it's been very almost random. I've always been surprised who gets a waiver and who doesn't.
I haven't had that many applicants who applied for them. I think maybe applicants neurotically feel like they have to take the test. And then generally speaking, the applicants who come to us generally are strong quantitatively. They're extremely determined and they generally do well on the test. I can think of a few applicants who have applied for them and have been granted them. And simple as that. I'm not sure that I have any major takeaway between who's gotten them and who hasn't.
Yeah. But as somebody who doesn't work very much on the admission side of things, what kinds of things do they need to demonstrate in order to be a good candidate for the waiver?
Right. I think it comes from all sorts of different categories. First of all, back in COVID days, you just couldn't take the test. Physically, you couldn't take the test. So then you could get a test waiver at all sorts of schools, including MIT. And then there's certainly a group of folks who, listen, they've proven themselves quantitatively. They are PhDs in math, engineers. It's very clear they're going to be able to do the work. And at that point, you can get a test waiver. Accountants can get test waivers. Sometimes there are folks with other graduate degrees who can get test waivers.
I would say maybe there are one or two applicants that I can think of where they came from a desired demographic and could prove that they could also prove that they wanted to, that they had the quantitative abilities, but I felt like, I'm just thinking of one or two in particular where they were able to say, I'm pretty committed to your program, I have these skills, I'm from a desired demographic, and I'm just not doing well with this test. I'm putting my cards on the table. And they're not just like asking for the test waiver, but they've been in touch with admissions and there's been some traction there.
They've been
so it's almost been like a negotiated discussion there. But
I agree with you.
That's not a huge sample, but it's kind of been an approach. Okay, so let's return to the topic before, because that's what applicants really want to know. What is a good score? And it's not just what's a good score on the new GMAT, but also breaking down, because that scale changed as well, right? Like before we would say, hey, you need a 47 quant or a 46 quant, 47 quant. And like even the individual score breakdowns have changed now. So we're using our concordance table, using our understanding of what certain scores meant. What do you think is kind of proves competency, and what do you think is a good headline score?
And it's a good question and a tricky question at the moment, because we haven't yet had a full application cycle or a full year where these scores are being used by a majority of applicants. So when the schools publish their averages, they're still publishing averages on the old scale. It won't be until probably after this next cycle that we're starting to see schools publishing what they're looking for on the new scale. But the organization that makes the GMAT, they've published essentially these tables that show you the conversion from the old scale to the new scale on both the total scores and on the section scores. So we talked about how 655 is the new 700 and 685 is the new 740, depending on the level of school that you're going for. For the individual sections now, each one is scored on a scale of 60 to 90. So 90 is a perfect score. You got everything right. So I'm going to talk about what's sort of the lowest that you would need to get in each section for that section to not raise an eyebrow.
Okay.
But if you hit the lowest on each section, you wouldn't be getting to the 655, right? So you have to have some sections that you have to have strengths and weaknesses. It's okay to have weaknesses, but you have to have some strengths in there too.
Right. You have to be able to show competency, but the minimum threshold for competency doesn't satisfy the school's averages.
For the whole thing, right.
You have to do better than competency
on at least one and usually two of the three sections.
Right.
So generally speaking, what we're seeing based on these tables that have been published, and also some things that we're starting to hear, but it's still, the data hasn't really been published yet from schools. Certainly, if you're looking at those 685 type schools, the 740 on the old scale type schools, your subsection score should really start with an 8. So
you max out at 90.
You max out at 90. So you're looking at getting in the 80s on those
Are they
sections.
all equal? And are they all tiered in the same way?
They're not exactly. Like if you go and you look at the percentile ranking for a score of say 80 on each of the three sections, they're different percentiles, and it's not just a few points off. Like there's a fairly significant difference in percentiles.
Are they weighted equally in the outcome?
But they are all weighted equally in your final score. Yes, you might be able to get away in whatever your weakest section is. You might be able to get away with kind of dropping a little bit below that 80 mark, especially if you're going for a 655 type score versus a 685. You may be able to get away with like a 78, 79 in one section. Unless I will say, if you're from a demographic that's expected to do well on quant, then your quant really should start with an 8. It should be in the 80 range. And this would be the difference on the old scale of a candidate scoring 45 versus 48. There were some people who really needed that 47, 48 because of their work background or where they were coming from. Right. Versus some people could get away with more of that 45.
Maybe we could just stop them for 1 second just to explain this on the most simple level. If you're, on the old scale, a 46, 47 would on the quant section of the GMAT would establish competency. Right. So if you have a 3.9 in economics, maybe the school could say, Jeremy, who doesn't have 3.9 in economics, but this theoretical Jeremy, it's okay that he has a 45 on the quant. His overall score is fine, and we know that he can manage because
he's proven it in this other program.
But let's say that Jeremy, the actual Jeremy that existed, who was the speechwriter, who doesn't have any quant classes because he's a liberal arts grad, again true, that person has a 44 quant or something like that, then maybe they're worried and they're saying like, this seems like a nice guy. Seems like he can contribute something to the class, but we're just not sure he can manage the quant. Yeah. And so there are raw sub-scores for each section of those tests and of the test, 3 sections on the GMAT. And that helps to give an indication to the admissions committee of your overall capabilities. So that's kind of where we're breaking things down right now, just to make sure that everyone is on the level here.
And the score that you were talking about on the old quant scale of like a 45, 46-ish, that's maybe 78 up to 80, like 45 to 47 range, something like that. And so that's really, if you're going to hit a 685, you're not going to do that by having any one of your scores be down in the 70s because there's just not enough to go up.
Top for the other sections.
For the other two sections. But if you're in the 655 range, one of those scores could be like a 78. Then the other two sections need to be in the mid to upper 80s in order to make up for
I feel like there's another episode of this podcast where Harold and I take a field trip and take the GMAT and talk about our scores.
That's it exactly. That's it exactly.
And your experience and how nervous you were in the testing center and all that fun stuff.
If I actually had to announce my legitimate score, I think I would be quite nervous in the test center. Yeah.
You know what? I mentioned this to Stacey before. You know who would surprise you in terms of how well they did on standardized tests?
Who's that?
Me.
That doesn't surprise me at all.
No,
Seriously,
no,
that doesn't surprise me at all.
I mean, my score was so good. When I used to tell people my score, they'd say, "Are you sure? Is that true?" So yeah, and it's always very strange. And in my mind, sometimes you find people who, okay, there are some people who maybe do great, but honestly, I'm very surprised sometimes when I have a PhD in math come in there and their quant score is terrible. And they almost can't do anything about it. And Stacey, you must see this all the time. Like, what's that all about?
Yeah, I see that all the time for people who have quite strong quant backgrounds and then struggle with quant on the test. And it really has to do with the fact that the way that they're approaching the quant section of the exam is the way that they approached math tests in school. But school math tests are not the GMAT. The GMAT is what's called a quantitative reasoning test, which is really, yes, you need to know the facts and the rules and the theories and everything behind the math, but you're using that to think your way logically through the scenario, the setup, and the problem. It's a more business-based approach to math, essentially. And so if you're trying to do this, what I did in math class at school, which is, you look at a problem and you figure out the steps and then you memorize the steps and then you just look for another problem that's exactly like that problem and spit the steps back.
Right.
That worked great in math in school. I got A's on my tests. That does not work on the GMAT because generally speaking, the questions that you're going to see on the test, they'll have parts that resemble questions you've studied before, but you're not going to see a question that's basically the same question you studied, but just with some different numbers or a different story behind it or something like that.
What do I do in that situation?
So it's a mindset shift, basically. You kind of almost have to go back to the basics. You are in that situation, you likely already know the quadratic formula and how stats work, and you know the facts and rules. It's not about that. It's about the way in which you're trying to apply them to the problem. And so that's a much more again, I'm going to say an executive reasoning or a business-focused approach where you're looking at a problem the way you would look at a problem that somebody presented to you at work. If someone at work was asking you, hey, we've got this information and we have to figure out what the weighted average of the products that we sold last month were, you wouldn't whip out a pen and start writing equations. You wouldn't treat it like a school math problem. You would start to go, well, we sold more of this one, so it's going to be weighted more heavily, and this one was priced at this, so the weighted average is going to be closer to this end of the scale, right? And you would do this, and you have multiple choice answers. Right. And that kind of thinking of like understanding what the theory is and how it works, that's going to be enough. Yes, you're going to have to do some number crunching, but you also don't have a calculator. It's not a math. It's not a math test. It's really about understanding what the math means, and then how to use that to apply to again, the scenario or the concept that's going on in the problem. No,
that makes sense then.
I do think that it is worth taking a step back because we're so focused on the tests right now, and we're obviously honored to have Stacey as our guest, but also to remind people that it is about an interplay between your stats. And I kind of alluded to this by saying, the theoretical Jeremy is the econ major versus Jeremy as the poli-sci major. Like the schools aren't just looking at your GMAT and saying, can this person manage the test score? They're looking at your GMAT. They're looking at your GPA. Sometimes they're looking at your undergrad GPA, your master's GPA. Sometimes they're looking at if you've taken the CFA or some other designation. You're a Six Sigma black belt. There are so many other indicators, and even sometimes it can happen through work experience. You can say, look, I'm an English major. For some reason, they hired me at McKinsey. I've done a couple of years at McKinsey, and I've proven I've got the analytical abilities. And so it's really a grouping of indicators that suggest that you have the competency at times, and then after that, after you've established competency, that's where it's kind of like, okay, there are some superficialities as well here, and the superficialities can be how high your GPA is, how high your test score is, and that work together to kind of help them protect their own their own averages for rankings purposes. But
class average matters actually.
Right, but like if you can be a little under on your GMAT, and you can struggle with showing competency on your GMAT and get that back a little bit with your GPA. It's not a perfect seesaw. Generally speaking, if you're going to have a weakness, it's better to have a weakness with your GPA than it is to have a weakness with your GMAT or your GRE for whatever reason. And
and that's simply because you can actually change it now. right? Like you can do something about it. Your GPA is done.
Yeah, but it's also like, I think it's just a weighting thing. I think that there's just more credibility in the here and now. I think it's such a backward-looking indicator.
Okay.
And I think it's actually got lower weighting with, I'm not 100% certain of this, but I think so, lower weighting with like U.S. News and World Report and the rankings and stuff like that. So I think they put more emphasis on the GMAT and the GRE.
Interesting.
And it's also, it's apples to apples, right? That's what's standardized about a standardized test.
It's true. That's.
There are a variety of factors, and it's a complicated game. So if anyone's listening to this, they're like, I'm discouraged by my GMAT performance. First of all, different people are discouraged by different things. In the old GMAT, I'd have people call me and they'd say, I'm discouraged by my GMAT performance. I have a 720. And I'd be like, okay, let's talk about this. Let's talk about this relative to your peer set. Let's talk about this. Like, you might be discouraged by that because you were testing at a 750, and maybe there's a way to get you there. But that in and of itself is not a fatal GMAT score at all. And so if anyone's listening, Harold does free consultations. I do some free consultations. Everyone on our team does free consultations. We do about, I think, 3,500 of them a year. And we're really more than happy to talk to you about your individual circumstances.
Exactly. 30 minutes, we can talk about whatever you want.
Yeah, whatever you want. You want to just talk to Harold about...
the Red Sox? By all means. That's it then. Just picking up a little bit on what Jeremy said, how important is it to do great on any one section versus just, sort of checking the box?
So on the GMAT, you got 3 exams feeding into your total score, ditto for the EA. And then on the GRE, you've got 2 sections. The GRE, you've got quant and verbal. And the quant section on the GRE has a little bit of data analytic type stuff, but it's a pretty small emphasis on that exam. So on the 2 exams out of the 3 sections, the GMAT and the EA, you can because they all feed into your total score and they're equally weighted, you can get away with having one of those sections be a bit lower than the other 2. If it's a lot lower, they're going to potentially be concerned about that section. So you're still trying to show a certain level of competence, a certain threshold level. But you can have strengths and weaknesses. Schools expect you to have strengths and weaknesses, and that's okay. So it's okay to have something that's lower. If you have 2 of the 3 sections not keeping up, then it's going to impact your total score. It's going to make it harder to lift your total score. On the GRE side, you've got 2 sections feeding into this, the quant and the verbal. And so for those 2, again, it's okay to have a little bit of one be stronger and one be weaker and have a little bit of a difference in those 2 scores, but you have to do pretty well in both sections.
Stacey, could you just give us a 1 minute on how does one prepare for these tests?
Yeah. First of all, give yourself enough time. You're probably going to need between 3 and 5 months of regular studying most days of the week. A lot of people don't give themselves enough time. And second is, don't just dive into the hardest material. All of these exams are adaptive, which means you actually have to earn the harder questions. You're not going to get there unless you don't make mistakes on the easier questions. Yeah. So you want to make sure that you're starting from the beginning, that you're giving yourself a solid foundation, especially on the math side. Most people have not done math on paper in a long time before they take these exams. Just give yourself a solid foundation, a good runway there to get started.
Can I jump in with 1 or 2 things that I've observed from my and I always say, seriously, people call me, I'm like, straight up call Stacey, call Manhattan Prep. But like, I feel like when I talk to people who are really struggling with the GMAT, a lot of the times, especially in the old GMAT, where I felt like so many people were maxing out on the quant, I felt like, I was like, have you studied verbal? Like people just sort of taking it for granted that they're just going to know verbal and not really studying for it and just being like, I know I've got to really kill it on the quant.
And they're nervous about the quant. So all of it, I can't tell you how many times I've had this question. There are points to pick up on all the sections.
Yeah.
So
I think the pop was bigger on the verbal in a weird way because there was so much clustering around the high levels of the quant, right?
Yeah. The scoring scales were a bit funny on the old exam. It's a little bit better. There are still some differences there, but it's a little bit better. They fixed that to a certain extent on the new exam. But in general, until you get to the top score, there's points to be earned on that section. So there's nothing wrong with it. It is true that you can't be super low on one section or it's going to hold back your total score and that section's going to raise an eyebrow. But if quant is your weakest section, great, get yourself to that 78 to 80 type score and then go hard on the other 2 sections and max those out. Use those to pick up the extra points that you want to get your total score.
Right.
Yeah, definitely. Right. Yeah, lean into your strengths. And obviously different sections are more important to different people. If you are a engineer coming from a foreign country whose English is not their first language or second language, then you know what? That verbal is going to be really pretty important. They're really going to be looking at that. The flip side is if you're someone, I'm not going to say who it is, who maybe is from Canada, they actually worked as a speechwriter. They didn't really know, I don't know, long division, we'll say. How important was the quant section when it came time to looking at their GMAT for schools? Jeremy, would you have any sense of this?
You'll have to ask those who admitted me and those who didn't. I definitely had to. I made up all my points in the verbal for sure. I'd love to go see my old my old test. I think it's been lost to time. Stacey and I were talking about this recently. They don't hold records beyond 10 years or something like that.
Yes, that's true.
So I took my test. I think the first year it was available to be done on computers. Probably around the time that people listening to this podcast or watching this podcast were born.
That's absolutely true.
And I believe either 1999 or 2000.
I think I took it the same year.
And
1997 was the year that it switched.
Oh, really? Okay. So maybe I took it in 1999. It was moving towards it then. Okay.
Yeah. I probably took it earlier then, but yes. So just thinking about last year, let's say I took the old exam. I did okay on it. I'm willing to take it again. I don't particularly want to. Should I take it again?
I mean, first of all, should you take it again depends upon whether the score that you got on the score that you already have on your record is a score that's competitive for the kinds of schools that you want to get into. So that's a question for you, not me.
No. Right.
But if the answer comes back, yeah, it would be helpful to have a better score on this test.
Right.
First of all, everything that you studied, and so we're talking about either the GMAT or the GRE, both of those changed last year. Everything that you studied for the old version of those exams, there's really nothing new that you need to study for the new versions of the exams. So for the GRE, there's nothing at all. It really is just a shorter exam. The time management changes a little bit because there's fewer questions and then a shorter time limit for each section, right? But you just get used to that and you're done. Everything else is the same. On the GMAT, they cut material.
Okay. So it's a shorter exam.
They didn't add, it's a shorter exam, but they also cut, you don't have to study grammar and you don't have to study geometry. They didn't add any new question types. So the question types that you studied for the old exam are the same question type. They cut one question type.
Right.
Okay, fine. But there's no new question types to learn.
Right.
So you're in a good position if you want to go and take that exam. It's likely the case that you didn't spend a huge amount of time studying what was then called the integrated reasoning section and is now called the data insight section because it wasn't part of your total score on the old exam.
That's absolutely true.
So you did already study this stuff though because you had to get an okay score at least on the old exam. So there will be some work to do there just to up your skills because now you're going for a higher score in that section, but you have already learned all of this stuff.
Two questions. One is, can you share some of the qualitative differences between the exams? Because one gives you a break, one gives you sections, selectivity or whatever they call it. There are some quirks and gimmicks to each one.
Yes. So each exam is trying to give you some measure of consistency, but also some feeling of control because nobody likes taking these exams, with the possible exception of me and my colleagues. And so some of the changes that have been introduced over the years on the GMAT, for example, you can choose, so there are 3 sections on the exam, and you can choose the order in which you do the sections. So generally speaking, we tell people put your best section first when your brain is, awake and you're ready to dive in and do it. Sorry, there's two things. Put your best section first, get off to a good start. Do your hardest section second, so that you're not doing it at the end when you're super tired, and then do your middle section third.
Okay.
You can also switch those two. You can do your hardest section first and do your best section second. We also don't recommend do your best section last because then you're starting to get tired. You might lose some points that you would have otherwise gotten. Whether you put your best section first or your hardest section first depends upon, do you want that ramp up to feel good about your performance before you have to dive into that section that you really don't like?
Right.
Or would you rather get that section that you hate over with because you're dreading it and you're just going to be thinking about it while you're doing something else?
Right. Stacey, just remind people, how long is each section?
So on the GMAT, each section is 45 minutes long.
Okay.
And then on that exam, you get one break, a 10-minute break, and you can choose when to take it. So you can choose between any 2 of those sections. On the GRE, you start out with an essay, a 30-minute essay. The GMAT has dropped the essay. So on the GRE, you start out with a 30-minute essay, and then you have a series of quant and verbal sections. And those ones, you don't get to choose the order. They come in any order. So you can have like quant, verbal. You could have quant, verbal. But a series of shorter sections going back and forth basically between quant and verbal.
Okay, you open the door. We got to go walk through it. Where does that 10-minute break? Where if you're taking it, are you taking it after the first section, after the second section?
On the GMAT, where you get to choose to take the break?
Yeah.
Okay. So basically, we tell people to go in with a rough idea of what they want to do, but also to be flexible. So what you can do basically is, ideally, you take your first and second section back to back, and then you give yourself a nice break before, when you're starting to get tired. So you give yourself a nice break before you get into that third section. You can leave the testing room or leave your seat if you're at home. Go have something to eat and drink. I do like some jumping jacks and do some stretching. Just kind of get the blood flowing back up to my brain. But give yourself that flexibility. If you do the first section and it just kicked your butt and you just really feel like, wow, that wiped me out. When I took the exam, I did the DI section first. It was the section I was the most nervous about from a time management perspective. So that's why I put it first. And I really was like, wow, that really, really kicked my butt. I thought I had done terribly. It turned out I did okay, but I thought I had done terribly. And then I was like, wow, should I take my break now or should I keep going? I put verbal second, which is my strongest section. And I was like, okay, now I need the break. I need to regroup because I really felt like kind of discombobulated by that by that first section. And so I had the flexibility. I went and I took the break and I shook it off. And then I got back in there and I was able to, to keep going on the test. If I'd felt fine in the first section, I would have kept going with the second section. Sure. And then I would have taken
Can you make that's it? Can you just be like, I don't even want it, let's go? Or do you have to take it?
You can, but you shouldn't.
Yeah. Right.
Even a lot of people will feel like, oh, I've got the adrenaline going, I'm going to keep going. Your brain needs the break. 2 hours and 15 minutes of full-on concentration of these hard questions, right? That's hard. And it's an adaptive test, so it's literally pushing you to the limit of your ability as you're taking the test. Yeah, take your break. I don't care if you feel like you take that break.
Right. Okay, so I said 2 questions. I asked the first. The second one was referenced in your response. There is no longer an analytical writing assessment in the GMAT, but it has reappeared. It has morphed and reappeared. It's a zombie. It's a vampire with a exactly back from the dead. Yes. So tell us about that.
Okay. So one of the ways in which the GMAT shortened the exam was to get rid of the essay, and frankly, that was the right call because the business schools don't care about they don't care very much about the essay because they ask you to write essays for the application. Of course, there are concerns around, are you really the one writing your essay? That those concerns existed before the existence of something like ChatGPT, but now it's making it easier to get help with your essays. And so sometime, 6 months after, 4 months after the new exam came out and the essay had been retired, Harvard said, wait a minute.
Right. Yes.
We might actually want that. We might want that essay after all because we know that it's a secure testing environment. So we know that it's the applicant and nobody else who's writing that essay. And so they asked GMAC, the organization that makes the GMAT, to basically give them something. So to bring it back, they didn't put it back into the GMAT because really there are only, so MIT has jumped on the bandwagon as well. And I would guess 1 or 2 other schools may. But what they basically said is that there are a couple schools who want it. Most schools, again, don't care about the essay and they're fine with that. And so what they've done is they've literally just taken this essay, they've made it a standalone thing. It costs $30 at this point to take it. It's something that will take you like maybe 4 to 5 hours to prep for. We've put free materials on our website and our free starter kits, the full materials, because we're not going to charge anybody to learn how to write a half-hour essay.
Is it still at a 6 or whatever?
It's still the same score. Yeah. It's the same. It's the
So
same.
it's actually the same product.
Okay. It is Harold, the old
speechwriter.
Yeah,
I took that AWA.
Yeah,
4 to 6.
There you go. You should be proud.
You tried to do too much with it, didn't you?
I don't know when I did. It was so long ago. But yes, that's it. I tried to do too much with it. Exactly. I was trying to be too cute.
Honestly, so I had a client who got a wonderful guy who got a 1 on the AWA. I've never seen a 1. I said to him, listen, I've never seen a 1. He's at Wharton now. Yeah. So just to show you.
And I've said to applicants over the years, like, I don't I've never heard any admissions officer ever give any feedback to us or to any applicant that says, we would have accepted this person, but for the AWA.
You're on the wait list. Can you go take the test again and up your essay score?
Yeah, because it's going to come at a later stage.
Where it's coming in now. So what Harvard and MIT have said is that they will, so they're not requiring everyone who took the GMAT, the new GMAT, to do this. It's only if you're invited to interview.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, if you're invited to interview.
We're giving you an indication of progress, which is going to amp up the pressure, like, oh, I better do well on this. And the answer is...
No, it really doesn't matter. It's a hoop to jump through.
But people will, I bet you'll see more people worried about this year.
Probably. But seriously, listen to us now. It's a hoop to jump through. Go to our GMAT free starter kit. Everything is there. We're not going to charge you time to get ready for this thing. It's all there.
Just express yourself comfortably and naturally.
It'll take you about 5 hours. You do a few practice essays and you'll be fine.
Manhattan Prep, you offer GMAT, GRE, and EA starter kits.
Yes.
Absolutely free.
Yep. Free starter kits. They basically will give you all the basics about the exams, about the time management and the test you should take, all of that stuff. Just kind of get you going with the basics. There's also a free Foundations of Math program.
Okay. Which is good for anybody, actually.
For anybody. All of this stuff is the math is math. The foundations of math is the same for all the tests. So,
yeah, absolutely. Listen, a lot of people are going to be listening to the podcast are simply scared by the entire process. They're scared by tests. They're scared by sitting down. They're scared by being sort of in front of a computer, being watched on the other end for 2.5 hours. If I come to you and I say, Stacey, I'm just scared about this whole thing, like, what do you say to me?
It's a stressful process. It's also the case as you're sitting there that you're thinking about a lot of things that are outside of just the test itself. This is one step of this huge application process, and then that's this huge step to go into the next part of your career to school, which could change. It could change your career, it could change your life. And the other part of the stress of this is you've presumably told your family and friends that you're doing this. And they're all asking you how you're doing. I tell my students, don't tell anybody when you're planning to take the real test.
Right.
So, because during the test, I don't want you thinking that as soon as the test is over, you're going to have to call X or text people and tell them. They're going to be like, how'd you do? Literally don't even tell them the day that you're taking it so that nobody has any idea. At least half of the students in my classes start out by saying, well, I'm just not good at these kinds of tests. Yeah. I'm just not good at standardized tests. Mm-hmm. And my response to that is, you haven't learned how to take this kind of test before. Most people, when they took tests, either they haven't taken tests like this before if they were educated outside of North America and the U.S. in particular, or they've taken lots of these tests in the U.S. and they've learned to dread them over time because the way that they were, it's conditioned response, but the way that they approached getting ready for them and the way that they were taught to get ready for them was this way that they were taught to approach tests in school. But these tests are really, really different. What they're expecting you to do, the time management aspect alone, right? Did you ever have a test in school where the teacher, purposely didn't give you enough time to finish the test?
Right.
That would be a terrible teacher. Why would they or purposely give you questions that they are pretty sure you're going to get wrong?
Yeah.
That are too hard for you?
That
would just be nonsensical to do for a school test.
Right.
That's how these tests work because it's not really a school test. And so, yes, if you can get ready for any test if you understand how the test works and you study accordingly and you're studying appropriately for how that test is constructed and for how it works. Right. And so if you're somebody who says, I'm just not good at standardized tests, it's because you just haven't been taught yet how to do standardized tests. But
and you can learn how to do them. At the end of the day, that's what your whole business is about.
Yes, exactly.
People can learn how to be very successful test takers.
Absolutely.
I think we have attacked this and dissected it, and we're very lucky to have Stacey with us to share her expertise. So modest, we could make her blush, but she has really helped to craft the most cutting-edge curriculum out there and has refined it over many, many years and is really the foremost voice in the world of GMAT and GRE prep. And so thank you so much for joining us.
And mbaMission only recommends Manhattan Prep when it comes to test prep.
And it's because they know what they're doing at a very different level. Yep. So we're very lucky to have this. I've had this partnership for over 15 years, or for 15. This is our 15th anniversary. We should have a big celebration.
There we go.
Well, great, and thanks for doing this, Harold.
Yeah, of course. Stacey Koprince of Manhattan Prep. Thank you very much for joining us today, Jeremy. As always, this is Harold Szymanski of the mbaMission podcast.